Thursday, September 14th, 1943, Camp Hearn, Texas, United States of America. Oberfeldwebel Klaus Bergmann stood in the afternoon heat, staring at the piece of paper in his trembling hand. Canteen coupons, 80 cents worth. Payment for a day's labor picking cotton in fields that stretched to a horizon he'd never imagined could exist. The paper felt impossibly clean between his dirt-crusted fingers, smooth and official, bearing English words he couldn't fully read, but whose meaning had just been explained by the camp interpreter. The Texas sun pressed down like a physical weight, different from the North African heat he'd endured with Rommel's Africa Corps. That heat had been dry, merciless, accompanied by thirst that turned your tongue to leather. This heat was thick, humid, wrapping around you like a wet blanket, but it was the paper in his hand that made sweat break out across his neck. Payment. The Americans were paying him. "They're paying us," muttered Gefreiter Ernst Weber beside him, his Bavarian accent thick with disbelief. "Paying us to work." Klaus looked at the line of men stretching ahead toward the camp canteen, each clutching similar coupons. Sunburned faces, gaunt from months in North African prison camps before the Atlantic crossing, wearing faded uniforms that had once been Africa Corps tan. They shuffled forward slowly, uncertainty in every step. Behind them, American guards watched with bored expressions, rifles slung casually over shoulders. No tension, no threat, just routine. "It's a trick," Klaus said quietly. The words came automatically, drilled into him by years of training. "Propaganda. They'll take photographs, show the world how well they treat us, then take it all back." But even as he spoke, he watched the man at the front of the line enter the canteen and emerge moments later carrying something. The distance was too great to see clearly, but the man's expression was visible. Shock. Pure, undiluted shock, and his hands were full. Klaus had been captured in Tunisia 4 months earlier, May 13, 1943, when what remained of the 21st Panzer Division finally surrendered after Tunis fell. He'd spent 3 years believing everything Joseph Goebbels had taught him about the enemy. America was weak, soft, decadent, a mongrel nation of inferior races and cowards who couldn't produce real soldiers. They fought with money and machines because they lacked German courage and discipline. The propaganda had been everywhere. Posters showing fat American plutocrats smoking cigars while German workers starved. Radio broadcasts describing cities of lazy criminals and degenerate jazz music. Newsreels proving American tanks were poorly made, American soldiers poorly trained. Germany was besieged by enemies. Yes, but enemies who could never match German will, German engineering, German racial superiority. Klaus had believed it all. Why wouldn't he? At 24, he'd known nothing but the Reich. Born in Stuttgart in 1919, raised in the Depression's aftermath, swept into the Hitler Youth at 14. By the time he was 17, belief wasn't a choice. It was the air you breathed. The Führer would lead them to victory. Germany would reclaim its rightful place. The lesser races would be crushed or subjugated. Simple truths, reinforced daily, never questioned. The numbers told a different story, though Klaus hadn't known those numbers until after capture. Germany produced 5,500 tanks in 1942. America produced 24,000. German aircraft production that year, 15,000. American, 48,000. The German war economy mobilized every available resource, stripped occupied territories bare, put women and children to work in factories. American factories, they'd been told, were struggling, inefficient, hampered by Jewish saboteurs and labor strikes. German soldiers received 2,500 calories per day in 1943. American soldiers received 4,200. That gap had seemed abstract when Klaus first heard it in the British prison camp in North Africa. Numbers on paper. But then came the Atlantic crossing, packed into the hold of a Liberty ship with 2,000 other prisoners. And the food kept coming. Hot meals, bread without sawdust, coffee, real coffee. The guards ate the same rations. Not better food, the same food. "You know what the truly mad part is?" Ernst said as they shuffled forward in line. "Back home, we'd work a full day in a munitions factory for maybe 30 pfennigs. Here, they pay us 80 cents American for picking cotton. Cotton, Klaus, Not building weapons, not even building anything useful for their war, just harvesting a plant. The line moved forward. Klaus could see the canteen more clearly now. A simple wooden structure, screen windows, hand-painted sign in English and German. Through the door, he glimpsed shelves with items on them. His stomach tightened. They'd arrived at Camp Hearn 3 weeks earlier, transported from a temporary holding facility in New York by train. The journey had been surreal. Through the windows, they'd watched America roll past. Cities that seemed to go on forever, undamaged by bombs. Factories with tall smokestacks pumping out production. Farmland so vast it made the fields of Germany look like garden plots. And the roads, everywhere. Endless roads filled with civilian automobiles. Actual civilians owned cars. Not just party officials, not just the military. Regular people. Impossible! A sergeant had muttered, watching a farm family in a truck pass by, the truck bed loaded with produce. Propaganda images. They're showing us staged prosperity. But it hadn't stopped. Town after town, mile after mile, the prosperity continued. At one stop, they'd watched a station platform where American soldiers waited for their train home on leave. The men were joking, laughing, some smoking cigarettes they casually tossed aside half-finished. They discarded food in trash bins. Discarded it. Food that looked better than anything Klaus had eaten in 2 years. The cotton picking had started yesterday. American farms faced labor shortages with so many men overseas, and the Geneva Convention allowed prisoner work details. Klaus had expected brutal treatment, perhaps beatings, certainly inadequate food and water during the long hours under the Texas sun. Instead, trucks brought them to and from the fields. Water was available throughout the day, cool from insulated containers. The farmer, a weathered man named Johnson who spoke no German but communicated through gestures and an interpreter, treated them with the same gruff courtesy he showed his remaining American workers. And now, payment. Klaus reached the canteen door. The interior was dim after the bright sunlight, and it took a moment for his eyes to adjust. When they did, he stopped breathing. Shelves lined the walls, not bare shelves with a few government-issued items. Actual shelves stocked like a shop in peacetime Stuttgart, cigarettes in neat rows, American brands he'd never heard of, Lucky Strike, Camel, Chesterfield, bars of soap wrapped in paper, toiletries, shaving cream, razors, writing paper and pencils, and food, chocolate bars, tins of cookies, bottles of something brown and fizzy with red labels. Coca-Cola, the American soldier behind the counter said, seeing his stare. He spoke in slow, loud English, as if volume would bridge the language gap. You want Coke? 5 cents. Or cigarettes, 20 cents per pack. Klaus looked at his coupons. 80 cents. He could buy 4 packs of cigarettes, or 16 bottles of this Coca-Cola, or any combination of the abundance before him. His hands began to shake. The propaganda had prepared him for deprivation, for American guards who would starve them, beat them, force them into slave labor. It had prepared him for a nation on the edge of economic collapse, unable to feed its own people, much less its prisoners. It had not prepared him for this. First time, the interpreter, a German-American private named Schmidt, appeared at his elbow. Most men react this way. Take your time. Klaus's voice came out hoarse. This is real? We can actually purchase these things. Every day you work, you get 80 cents in coupons. Officers who don't work get a basic allowance. You can spend it here or save it in an account for after the war. Schmidt's expression held something like pity. I know it's a shock. Every new arrival goes through this. Klaus pointed at the Coca-Cola with a trembling finger. What is that? Soda, soft drink, sweet, carbonated, very American. You want to try one? He nodded, unable to speak. His coupons changed hands. The American soldier behind the counter pulled a bottle from an ice box with actual ice, and used a metal opener to remove the cap. The hiss of carbonation sounded impossibly loud in Klaus's ears. The bottle was cold. Cold in September, in Texas. Casually cold because America could afford to ice down soda for prisoners of war. Klaus raised it to his lips and drank. The sweetness exploded across his tongue, carbonation tingling, cold liquid flooding his mouth. It tasted like nothing he'd ever experienced. Not the thin ersatz drinks of wartime Germany. This was real sugar, real flavor, wasteful in its abundance. He'd been taught Americans were weak. This didn't taste weak. This tasted like a nation that could afford to give its enemies luxuries. Klaus walked out of the canteen in a daze, clutching the half-empty bottle and his remaining coupons. Ernst stood waiting, his own arms full. 2 packs of cigarettes, a chocolate bar, a bar of soap still in its wrapper. "The soap smells like flowers," Ernst said, his voice hollow. "Real flowers. The chocolate, Klaus. It's actual chocolate. Not that compressed dust they gave us in rations. I tasted it. Real sugar, real cocoa." Around them, other prisoners emerged carrying their purchases. Some wept openly. Others stared at items in their hands as if they might vanish. One man, a corporal from Hamburg, sat on the ground and carefully unwrapped a chocolate bar, breaking off a single square and placing it on his tongue. His eyes closed. Tears ran down his weathered cheeks. "They told us America was starving," Klaus said to no one in particular, "that their economy had collapsed, that they couldn't even feed their own people." Ernst lit one of his cigarettes with shaking hands. "They told us many things." That night, Klaus lay on his bunk in the prisoner barracks and stared at the ceiling. The barracks were simple but clean, with actual mattresses instead of bare boards. Screens on the windows kept out mosquitoes, electric lights overhead, a working latrine with running water. He'd been in German army barracks in 1940 that weren't as well maintained. The chocolate bar he'd purchased sat on the small shelf beside his bed, still wrapped. He'd eaten half the Coca-Cola bottle's contents and saved the rest. The experience had been too overwhelming to finish in one sitting. Now, in the darkness, he unwrapped one corner of the chocolate and broke off a piece. The taste confirmed what he'd feared. This was real chocolate, the kind he remembered from childhood before the war. Rich, sweet, complex. Not the brown sawdust they'd been issued in Africa, cut with who knew what to stretch supplies. This was what chocolate actually tasted like when a nation had the resources to make it properly. Germany produced 80,000 tons of chocolate in 1942, most of it requisitioned for the military. America produced 450,000 tons, and they could spare enough to sell to prisoners in camp canteens for pocket change. "Can't sleep either." Ernst's voice came from the adjacent bunk. "No. Keep thinking about the canteen. About the soap that smells like flowers. About the farmer today, Johnson, who made sure we had shade during the midday break. About the guards who don't beat us." Ernst shifted in his bunk. "About everything they told us that was a lie." Klaus said nothing. What was there to say? The evidence was mounting, piece by piece, hour by hour. Each observation chipped away at the foundation of everything he'd believed. Germany was losing this war, not because of cowardice or betrayal or Jewish conspiracies, because the enemy was stronger, richer, more productive, more humane. The next morning brought another work detail, this time at a different farm owned by a family named Peterson. The routine was the same. Early transport, distribution to fields, water provided throughout the day, a lunch break with actual food. Klaus watched the American farm hands work alongside them, joking in English he couldn't understand, sharing cigarettes during breaks. The Petersons had 2 sons in the military, the interpreter explained. One was in England, preparing for the invasion everyone knew was coming. The other was in the Pacific, fighting the Japanese. Yet here the Petersons were, feeding German prisoners lunch from their own kitchen, ham sandwiches on white bread, real ham, thick slices, bread so soft it felt like cake after years of dense black bread, an apple for each man, crisp and sweet, and coffee, hot and strong and plentiful. The Petersons' wife brought the food out in her own truck, a Ford model that looked 5 years old but ran smoothly. She was middle-aged, plain-faced, wearing a simple dress and practical shoes. She smiled at the prisoners as she distributed the food, saying something in English that the interpreter translated. She says her boys are prisoners somewhere too. She hopes someone is feeding them lunch. Klaus stared at the sandwich in his hands. The propaganda had taught him Americans were barbaric, that they would torture and starve prisoners. This woman hoped her own sons, prisoners of Germany, were being treated half as well as she treated the men who'd fought to kill them. He couldn't finish the sandwich. His throat had closed up. By the end of the first week, Klaus had accumulated $4 in canteen coupons. He spent it slowly, carefully, each purchase a small act of cognitive dissonance, a pack of American cigarettes that tasted smoother than anything from Germany, another bottle of Coca-Cola, writing paper to send letters home, though he struggled with what to write. How could he describe this to his parents in Stuttgart? How could he tell his sister that the enemy fed him better than the Wehrmacht had? September turned to October, the cotton harvest continued, and the routine became familiar. Up at dawn, breakfast in the camp mess hall, hot food, plentiful portions, coffee that never ran out, transport to the farms, work under the Texas sun, hard but manageable, lunch provided, transport back, evening meal, then free time in the compound. The compound itself was another revelation. A recreation hall with books, German newspapers flown in from New York's German-language press, tables for cards and chess, a sports field where prisoners played football in the evenings, chapel services on Sundays for those who wanted them. The Americans had even provided materials for prisoners to build a small theater where men with acting experience staged plays. On October 12th, Klaus attended his first production, a comedy from the 1920s that half the prisoners knew by heart. The makeshift stage was crude, the costumes improvised, but the performance was earnest and the audience laughed genuinely. He sat in the back row and watched German men, prisoners of war, laughing and enjoying theater, while the Reich they'd fought for burned. The irony was suffocating. My father was in America during the last war, a new arrival named Friedrich Kohler said one evening. They sat outside the barracks in October twilight, smoking cigarettes purchased with their wages. Friedrich was older, 38, an engineer from Munich who'd been drafted in 1942. He was captured in France in 1918, spent 6 months in a camp in Kansas. Said it was the best he'd been treated since 1914. I thought he was exaggerating. He wasn't, Klaus said. No. Friedrich exhaled smoke slowly. The guard this morning, young fellow from Oklahoma, he showed me photographs of his family, his wife, 2 children, just showed them to me, like we were neighbors talking over a fence, not enemies, not superior race and inferior, just 2 men. Stories accumulated like water behind a dam. Unteroffizier Hans Keller from Berlin worked at a processing plant in nearby Bryan, helping con vegetables for civilian consumption. He reported that the American civilians working alongside him shared their lunches freely, offered him cigarettes, tried to teach him English phrases. The plant processed more vegetables in a day than he'd seen in a month in Germany. Gefreiter Paul Meyer worked construction at the camp, helping build additional barracks for an expected influx of new prisoners. The American foreman, a man named Roberts, treated the German workers with the same gruff professionalism he showed his American crew. When it rained, everyone took shelter together. When someone made a mistake, Roberts corrected it without beatings or screaming. The work was hard, but it was just work. Feldwebel Otto Schmidt, a veteran of the Eastern Front before his transfer to Africa, found himself detailed to the camp motor pool, maintaining vehicles. The machinery was astounding. Trucks that ran smoothly with parts available when needed, tools in good repair, oil that didn't need filtering and reusing. The waste horrified him. Americans would discard a vehicle component that could have been repaired simply because getting a new part was easier than fixing the old one. They don't repair anything, Otto told Klaus one evening. Yesterday, a sergeant threw away a perfectly good socket wrench because the handle was cracked, threw it away. Back home, we'd have wrapped it in tape and used it for another year. Here, easier to get a new one. The abundance became oppressive. Every day brought new evidence that everything they'd been taught was a lie. Germany was not superior. German engineering was not unmatched. American machinery ran longer, required less maintenance, and was produced in quantities that made German output look artisanal. German soldiers were not the world's finest. American troops had decisively beaten them in Africa with better equipment, better supply lines, better coordination. German sacrifice and discipline hadn't created strength. They'd merely prolonged inevitable defeat against an enemy with 10 times the resources. October became November. Klaus's canteen account grew. He purchased small luxuries that would have been unthinkable in Germany. Genuine toothpaste, not the gritty substitute they'd used in the army. American razor blades that stayed sharp. A notebook with paper smooth enough to write on both sides. Chocolate bars he sometimes ate and sometimes saved, unable to believe they would still be available next week. The American guards remained a puzzle. Some were friendly, teaching prisoners English phrases, sharing cigarettes, showing photographs of home. Others were distant but fair, maintaining professional detachment. None were cruel. A few were openly kind. Klaus couldn't reconcile this with the propaganda that had painted Americans as savage brutes. Private Johnson, a farm boy from Iowa, worked the night watch on Klaus's barracks section. He was 19, drafted 6 months earlier, initially afraid of the German prisoners he'd been told were elite killers. Over weeks of night shifts, he'd started conversations with prisoners who spoke English, asking about Germany, about the war, about their lives. He brought a baseball one evening and tried to teach them the game, laughing when they couldn't grasp the rules. "My pa says we should just shoot all you Nazis and be done with it," Johnson confided to the interpreter one night, loud enough for nearby prisoners to hear. "But you fellows don't seem like monsters. Just seem like soldiers, same as us. Don't know what to think about that." Klaus didn't know what to think either. He'd been taught Americans were degenerate, weak, mongrelized. Johnson was none of those things. He was young, earnest, homesick, and treated his duties with the same basic competence Klaus had seen in good German soldiers. The enemy was human. That shouldn't have been a revelation, but after years of propaganda, it was. By mid-November, Klaus had been in Camp Herne for 2 months. His physical condition had improved dramatically. Regular meals, adequate rest, no combat stress. He'd gained 15 pounds of healthy weight. His skin had lost the gray tinge of chronic malnutrition. The persistent cough that had plagued him in Africa had cleared up. He could see the same transformation in his fellow prisoners. Men who'd arrived gaunt and haunted now looked healthy, almost prosperous. The guards joked that German POWs ate better than American civilians under rationing. It was true. Camp food was plentiful, well prepared, varied. Meat at most meals, fresh vegetables when available, bread without substitutes, and prisoners could supplement with canteen purchases, chocolate, cookies, canned goods. Meanwhile, letters from home described ration cards, food shortages, hunger that was becoming desperation. Klaus's mother wrote in October. The letter arrived in mid-November, forwarded through the International Red Cross. Her handwriting was shaky, her words carefully chosen to avoid military censors. She was proud of him, she wrote, proud that he served the fatherland. The neighborhood had been bombed again. The RAF came almost nightly now. Food was scarce, but they managed. His father's factory had been hit, but was still operating. His sister Maria had been sent to work on a farm in Bavaria. Everyone sacrificed for final victory. Reading it in his warm barracks, stomach full from dinner, having just purchased cigarettes and chocolate with money earned picking cotton, Klaus felt shame so profound it made him physically ill. His mother was starving. His family was being bombed. Germany was being destroyed. And he was comfortable, well-fed, safe, treated better as a prisoner than he'd been treated as a soldier. The dam burst during a conversation on November 28th. A group of 8 prisoners sat outside in unseasonably warm weather, smoking American cigarettes and drinking bootleg coffee one of them had brewed on an improvised hot plate. Someone made a joke about the Africa Corps being the only German unit guaranteed 3 meals a day. The laughter that followed had a bitter edge. "We were supposed to be the elite," Ernst said, his voice flat. "Rommel's finest, the vanguard of the master race. And here we sit, in Texas, picking cotton and eating chocolate while the fatherland burns." "The fatherland is a lie," Otto said suddenly. He was the oldest of the group at 41, a career soldier who'd fought in Poland, France, and Russia before Africa. All of it. The propaganda, the promises, the greatness, all lies. Silence fell. Saying such things aloud was dangerous even here, even surrounded by fellow prisoners. Informers existed, hardline Nazis who would report defeatist talk to camp authorities. But Otto continued, "I've been a soldier for 20 years. I've seen German efficiency and German discipline. I've seen what our military can do. And then I came here." He gestured at the camp around them, the electric lights beginning to glow in the November dusk. "Look at this. Look at what they've built. How they've organized this camp. Look at how they treat us. Now compare that to how we treated Russian prisoners on the Eastern Front." No one spoke. They all knew. The Eastern Front had been brutal beyond description. Soviet prisoners died by millions in German camps, starved deliberately, worked to death, shot when they became inconvenient. German propaganda called them subhuman. German policy treated them as such. "We were told Americans were weak," Klaus said quietly. "Decadent, inferior, but they beat us in Africa with one hand tied behind their backs. And now they feed us better than our own army fed us. They pay us for work. They treat us like human beings. While we," his voice caught, "while we did things in Russia that I can't even speak about." "The chocolate," Friedrich said, his voice thick. "That's what broke me. I bought a chocolate bar last week. Real chocolate like before the war. My son is 6 years old. He's never tasted real chocolate. He's in Munich, eating sawdust bread and whatever synthetic garbage the Reich produces. And I'm eating real chocolate because America has so much abundance they can give it to their enemies." Ernst laughed, a sound without humor. "They let us buy beer. Beer! The camp canteen sells German-style lager, not even American beer. They import German beer for the prisoners because they know we prefer it. Meanwhile, my brother writes from Hamburg that they haven't seen real beer in a year, just some thin substitute made from God knows what." The conversation continued into the night, voices low but urgent, each man unburdening himself of observations that had accumulated over months. The American farm families who treated them kindly, the guards who were professional but not cruel, the abundance everywhere, the casual waste, the sheer productive capacity of a nation that could fight a two-front war while maintaining prosperity at home. The contrast with Germany's desperation, its scorched earth total war, its increasingly obvious trajectory toward complete defeat. Klaus spoke about the Coca-Cola that first day, how the cold sweetness had shattered something inside him. Ernst described working at the Peterson farm, watching Mrs. Peterson pack care packages for her sons who were prisoners somewhere, perhaps in Germany. Otto talked about the motor pool, the waste that came from abundance, the casual replacement of parts that would have been desperately hoarded in the Reich. By the time they dispersed to sleep, something had changed. The group had spoken truths aloud that could not be unspoken. Germany was doomed. The Reich they'd fought for was built on lies. The enemy was not inferior. They were vastly superior in every material way, and, in treatment of prisoners, morally superior as well. Klaus lay awake that night, staring at the barracks ceiling. In the darkness, he could hear others breathing, some snoring, someone crying, quietly. He thought about his mother in Stuttgart, his sister on some Bavarian farm, his father in a bombed factory. He thought about the German prisoners on the Eastern Front who hadn't survived because Germany couldn't or wouldn't feed them. He thought about what would happen when this war finally ended, as it must end, with German defeat. And he thought about the 80 cents in canteen coupons sitting in his footlocker, wages for a day's work, the price of admission to understanding how completely he'd been deceived. December brought colder weather to Texas. Not the brutal cold of a German winter, but enough to require jackets. The camp issued American surplus coats, heavy and warm. Klaus wore his while working at a farm near College Station, harvesting the last of the season's vegetables. The farmer, an elderly man named Henderson, moved slowly, but worked steadily, his hands gnarled from decades of labor. He spoke no German. Klaus spoke minimal English. But during the lunch break, Henderson gestured for Klaus to sit on the back of his truck and shared his thermos of coffee. The coffee was black, strong, and hot. They sat in companionable silence, two men who'd been taught they should be enemies, sharing a drink on a December afternoon. After a while, Henderson pulled out a photograph from his wallet. Two young men in army uniforms. He pointed at them, then at Klaus, then made a gesture Klaus understood. His sons. Soldiers. Maybe prisoners like Klaus. Maybe dead. Klaus pulled out his own photograph, creased and worn from months of carrying. His sister Maria, taken before the war when she was 16, smiling in her Sunday dress. He showed it to Henderson. The old farmer studied it, nodded, and carefully handed it back. Neither man spoke. There was nothing to say. That evening, Klaus attended chapel service for the first time. He wasn't particularly religious, but something in the conversation with Henderson had unsettled him. The chapel was a converted recreation room, rows of benches, a simple altar. About 50 prisoners attended. The chaplain was a German Lutheran pastor named Gerhard, captured in Tunisia the same day as Klaus. Pastor Gerhard's sermon wasn't about victory or sacrifice or the glory of the fatherland. It was about Joseph, sold into slavery in Egypt, who discovered that God's plan was larger and stranger than he'd imagined. About finding grace in unexpected places. About the danger of believing you knew the whole truth when you'd only been told part of it. We came here as enemies, Pastor Gerhardt said, his voice soft in the quiet room. "We came believing we were superior, that our cause was just, that we fought for something noble, and then we encountered a different truth. Not the truth we were taught, not the truth we wanted, but truth nonetheless. The question before us now is, what do we do with that truth?" Klaus sat in the back row and wept. He wasn't alone. By the time the service ended, half the prisoners were crying. Someone started singing Stille Nacht, Silent Night, and the rest joined in. The Christmas carol sounded different here, in a prisoner of war camp in Texas, sung by men who no longer believed in the cause they'd fought for. Christmas 1943 brought a strange celebration. The Americans allowed prisoners to decorate the recreation hall, provided materials for a Christmas tree, and served a special meal: roast pork, potatoes, vegetables, pie made with real sugar and real butter. The camp commander, Colonel Morrison, walked through the mess hall during dinner, observing but not interfering. Some prisoners saluted him. He returned the salutes gravely, then continued his rounds. After dinner, Ernst found Klaus in the barracks. "They're showing a film tonight, American Christmas movie. It's a Wonderful Life, released last year. Supposed to be good." Klaus had seen German films in the camp's makeshift theater, propaganda pieces mostly, captured from shipments meant for German communities in South America. They all followed the same formula: Germany victorious, enemies defeated, the Reich triumphant. The disconnect between the films and reality was painful. The American film was different. It was about a man who thought his life was worthless, who wished he'd never been born, and who learned through supernatural intervention how much he mattered to his community. The plot was sentimental, almost saccharine, but sitting in a room full of German prisoners watching an American film about the value of human life and community, Klaus felt something shift. The man in the film, George Bailey, wasn't special. He was ordinary, trapped in an ordinary life, facing ordinary problems. But his ordinariness was his value. He mattered because every person matters, because communities are built from individual connections and kindnesses. It was the opposite of everything Klaus had been taught about greatness and destiny and the superiority of the strong. The film ended with the main character surrounded by friends and family, understanding finally that his ordinary life was valuable precisely because he'd touched other ordinary lives. The prisoners filed out quietly, many lost in thought. Klaus heard fragments of conversation in the darkness. Never seen an American film like that before. It wasn't about power or war, just about living. Did you notice? The banker was the villain, the rich man. In German films, the rich industrialists are heroes. Klaus walked back to his barracks through December cold, his American surplus coat warm around him, and tried to process what he'd seen. An American film celebrating ordinariness, celebrating community over individual greatness, celebrating the value of every person, not just the strong or the racially pure or the ideologically committed. The contrast with German ideology was total. Klaus had been raised to believe in greatness, in the destiny of the German people, in the natural hierarchy of races, in the value of strength over weakness. And here was America, making films about ordinary people living ordinary lives and finding that valuable, making those films while simultaneously outproducing Germany 50-1 and defeating the Wehrmacht on multiple fronts. Maybe that was the point. Maybe the strength came from valuing everyone, from building society on inclusion rather than exclusion. Maybe that's why America had such abundance, because they didn't waste half their population's potential on maintaining racial hierarchies. The thought was revolutionary and terrifying. January 1944 arrived cold and clear. Klaus had now been imprisoned for 8 months, 4 of them at Camp Hearn. His canteen account held over $20, wages from 3 months of work. He could have spent it on luxuries, but instead, he found himself saving it. Uncertain why. Perhaps because spending it felt like accepting his situation. Perhaps because hoarding money felt like maintaining some control. Work continued on various farms around the region. The cotton harvest had ended, replaced by winter wheat planting, equipment maintenance, general farm labor. The routine was established now. Wake, breakfast, transport, work, lunch, work, transport back, dinner, free time. It was, Klaus realized, the most stable his life had been since 1939. The Americans announced new policies in January. Prisoners with useful skills could attend education programs, English classes, agricultural techniques, even some basic engineering courses taught by American professors from nearby Texas A&M University. The opportunities were voluntary, but the response was overwhelming. Hundreds of prisoners signed up. Klaus enrolled in English lessons. The teacher was an American civilian, Mrs. Patterson, a middle-aged woman who'd taught high school before the war. She was patient, methodical, and treated her students with the same professional courtesy Klaus imagined she'd shown American teenagers. Within weeks, he could construct basic sentences. Within 2 months, he could hold simple conversations. The language lessons were transformative in unexpected ways. Learning English meant engaging with American thinking patterns, American idioms, American cultural references. Mrs. Patterson taught vocabulary through context, using American newspapers, magazine articles, advertising. Every lesson was a window into American life. One article discussed rationing. Americans complained about limited butter, meat, sugar. They considered it a hardship worth complaining about publicly. Klaus thought of German rations, thin soup, black bread, ersatz, everything, and almost laughed. Americans thought rationing was a hardship. Germans thought starvation was patriotic sacrifice. Another article profiled a factory worker, a woman named Rose, who'd taken a job building aircraft while her husband served in Europe. She earned enough to save money, enough to support her family comfortably, and she was proud of her contribution. The article celebrated her as a typical American patriot. Klaus tried to imagine a German newspaper celebrating a factory worker's pride in earning good wages. It was inconceivable. English lessons led to conversations with guards, halting at first, but improving. Private Johnson, the Iowa farm boy, became a regular conversational partner. They discussed farming. Johnson's father grew corn and soybeans, and Klaus described Stuttgart's surrounding countryside, the small farms that fed the city before the war. My uncle had a dairy farm, Klaus said in broken English one February evening. 20 cows, small operation, proud man, very German, very traditional, Johnson nodded. My pa's got about 100 head of cattle, plus the crops. Medium-sized operation by Iowa standards. Some farms got thousands of acres. Machinery does most of the work now. Thousands of acres. Machinery everywhere. Klaus had seen it himself during work details. American farms operated on a scale that made German agriculture look medieval. One man on a tractor could do the work of 50 men with hand tools. And America had tractors to spare. They built them by the tens of thousands, sold them or gave them away to farmers, replaced them when they wore out. Germany had diverted all industrial production to weapons. America built weapons and tractors and cars and refrigerators and radios and everything else simultaneously. Your country is very rich, Klaus said carefully. Johnson shrugged. Guess so. Never really thought about it. Just seems normal to me. Pa always said we were just getting by. But compared to what you fellas describe, maybe we're doing all right. Just getting by. American getting by meant more abundance than German prosperity had ever achieved. February brought news that the camp population would expand significantly. New prisoner shipments were arriving from Europe as the Allied advance continued. The camp began construction of additional barracks, and Klaus found himself assigned to the construction crew. The work was hard but satisfying. Building something useful, learning carpentry techniques, working alongside American contractors who treated German POWs as part of the team. The foreman, a Texan named Murphy, was a master carpenter who'd been building houses for 30 years. He showed Klaus how to frame a wall properly, how to ensure square corners, how to read building plans. Murphy worked steadily, efficiently, and expected the same from his crew regardless of nationality. When Klaus made a mistake, nailing a brace at the wrong angle, Murphy simply pointed it out, explained the correction, and moved on. No screaming, no punishment, just professional instruction. You're pretty good with tools, Murphy said one afternoon, watching Klaus work. You do this kind of work back home? No, factory work. Before Army? Well, you got a knack for it. Keep practicing. You could make a living doing this after the war. After the war. The phrase hung in the air between them. After Germany's defeat, after the Reich collapsed, after everything Klaus had fought for was destroyed. What then? Return to a devastated homeland with carpentry skills learned from the enemy. But the alternative was what? Return with nothing but memories of fighting for lies. March 1944 marked 1 year since Klaus's capture. The anniversary passed without official recognition, but he noted it privately. 1 year of captivity. 1 year of discovering that everything he'd been taught was propaganda. 1 year of comfortable imprisonment while Germany burned. Letters from home came irregularly now. When they arrived, they were heavily censored. Black ink redacting anything that might provide military intelligence. But between the lines, Klaus could read the truth. His mother's handwriting grew shakier. Food shortages were worse. Bombing intensified. His sister had been injured in a raid. Not seriously, his mother assured him, but she'd been hurt. His father's factory had been destroyed completely. Klaus sat in his warm barracks, stomach full from dinner, reading about his family's suffering, and felt guilt like acid. He was safe. They were dying, and there was nothing he could do. "You can send them money," Ernst said, seeing his expression. Ernst had been sending portions of his canteen earnings home through the Red Cross since January. "Won't help much, but it's something." Klaus stared at him. Send American money home. Money earned working for the enemy. It felt like betrayal. But what was the alternative? Let his family starve while he hoarded wages from picking cotton. He sent $20 home that week. It probably amounted to very little in wartime Germany, where currency was increasingly meaningless and everything required ration cards. But it was something, a gesture, an acknowledgement that he was alive and they were suffering. The new prisoners began arriving in late March, hundreds of them captured in Italy as the Allied advance ground northward. They arrived gaunt, shell-shocked, some wounded, all expecting brutal treatment. Klaus watched them shuffle off the transport trucks, saw their expressions when they saw the camp. Clean barracks, electric lights, no visible brutality. The confusion was total. Klaus and several other long-term prisoners were assigned to help orient the newcomers. It was surreal. German soldiers helping other German soldiers adjust to comfortable American captivity. Klaus found himself explaining the canteen system, the work details, the wages, the treatment. The new arrivals listened with stunned disbelief. "They pay us." A young corporal from Munich kept repeating. "The Americans pay us to work. 80 cents per day. Officers get allowances even without working. Geneva Convention rules." But the radio said American camps were death camps, that they starved prisoners and worked them to death. Klaus met the young man's eyes. The radio lied. Those 3 words became his mantra over the following weeks as waves of new prisoners arrived. The radio lied. The newspapers lied. The propaganda lied about American brutality, about American weakness, about American capacity, about everything. Klaus found himself becoming an informal teacher, helping newcomers understand the reality they'd entered. Stories like Klaus's, stories of prisoners discovering they could earn money and purchase goods in American camps, reveal a profound disconnect between what Axis soldiers were taught and what they experienced. If this hidden chapter of World War II fascinates you, subscribe so you don't miss more untold stories. And let me know in the comments, had you heard about POW wages before? Some new arrivals adapted quickly. Others resisted, clinging to propaganda even in the face of overwhelming evidence. A hardcore Nazi contingent formed among the newcomers, men who refused to work, who harassed those who accepted camp life, who maintained that Germany would still achieve victory. Camp authorities separated them into a different section, but their presence was a reminder that not everyone could accept truth when it contradicted belief. Klaus understood their resistance. He'd felt it himself those first weeks. The cognitive dissonance was painful. Accepting that you'd been lied to meant accepting that you'd fought and killed for nothing. That friends had died for lies. That you'd wasted years of your life serving evil disguised as greatness. But denial didn't change reality. Germany was losing. The evidence was everywhere. American newspapers in the camp library reported Allied advances on all fronts. D-Day came in June 1944, and the prisoners followed the Normandy invasion through American media. Some cheered secretly for German defenders. Others understood that every day the war continued meant more destruction of Germany itself. Klaus fell into the second category. By summer 1944, he wanted the war to end, not for Germany to win. That was impossible now, just to end. Stop the killing. Stop the bombing. Save what remained of Germany before everything was destroyed. He shared this opinion quietly, carefully, only with trusted friends. Saying it openly was dangerous even here. The hardcore Nazis would report defeatist talk. Even moderate prisoners might be offended by such blatant acceptance of defeat. But among his small circle, Ernst, Otto, Friedrich, a few others, honesty was possible. "My son is 12 now," Friedrich said one evening. They sat outside in July heat, drinking iced tea purchased from the canteen. Iced tea in summer because America could afford to provide prisoners with luxury beverages. "He's old enough to be drafted into the Volkssturm if things get desperate enough. I pray this war ends before they put a rifle in his hands." Otto nodded. "My wife writes that they're conscripting everyone, old men, boys. They gave her factory work a rifle and told her to prepare for defense. She's a seamstress. What's she going to defend with a rifle she doesn't know how to shoot?" The end was coming. Even hardline prisoners couldn't deny it forever. The Allied advance continued. Germany's cities were being systematically destroyed from the air. Resources were exhausted. The wonder weapons promised by propaganda, the jets, the rockets, the supertanks, either didn't exist or came too late in insufficient numbers. Klaus continued working, continued learning English, continued saving money he didn't know what to do with. His canteen account grew to over $100 by autumn. He spent little, saved compulsively, as if the money might somehow matter when the world he'd known collapsed completely. September 1944 brought a new work detail. Klaus was assigned to a school construction project in Bryan, Texas. The town needed a new elementary school, and prisoner labor supplemented the construction crew. It was strange work for soldiers, building a school, a place dedicated to educating children in enemy territory. But the work was interesting. The American contractors treated the prisoners fairly, and the wages continued. The school principal, Mrs. Henderson, visited the site occasionally to check progress. She was a stern-looking woman in her 50s, but she brought cold lemonade for the workers on hot days and thanked them politely for their labor. Klaus learned through the interpreter that her husband had died at Anzio. She was building a school while grieving a husband killed by Germans. Yet she treated German prisoners with basic courtesy. The contrast was unbearable. Klaus thought of occupied Poland, occupied Russia, occupied France. How had German authorities treated civilians there? How had German soldiers treated local populations? He knew the answer. He'd seen it, participated in it, though he'd tried not to think about it since capture. The master race didn't build schools for inferior peoples. The master race extracted resources, imposed order through fear, and destroyed anyone who resisted. Mrs. Henderson's husband had died fighting that system, and here she was, treating the men who'd supported that system with basic human decency. Klaus worked on that school through October and November, and with every board nailed, every wall framed, every window installed, he felt the weight of what he'd been part of. This building would educate American children for decades. He was building a future for the enemy's children. It felt right in a way that nothing in the war had felt right. December 1944 brought news of the German offensive in the Ardennes, what Americans called the Battle of the Bulge. For a brief moment, hardcore prisoners in the camp celebrated. Germany was counterattacking. Perhaps victory was still possible. Perhaps the tide would turn. Klaus read the American newspapers and understood the truth. It was a desperate gamble, a final offensive using Germany's last reserves. Even if it succeeded tactically, it couldn't change the strategic situation. Germany was exhausted. This was death throes, not resurgence. The offensive stalled by Christmas. Within weeks, it had collapsed completely. Even the hardliners grew quiet after that. There was no more talk of final victory. Just silence and waiting for the inevitable end. Klaus spent Christmas 1944 in the camp chapel again, listening to Pastor Gerhard speak about redemption and forgiveness, about how Joseph, enslaved in Egypt, eventually forgave his brothers who'd sold him, about how grace worked in mysterious ways, how suffering could lead to understanding, how God's purposes were larger than human nations and human wars. "We will go home eventually," Pastor Gerhard said. "Back to a Germany that will be destroyed, occupied, perhaps divided. We will face judgment for what Germany has done, and rightfully so. But we will also carry with us knowledge. We have seen how the enemy treated us. We have seen their abundance, their technology, their humanity. We have seen what a society looks like when it doesn't build itself on hate and conquest. That knowledge is valuable. That knowledge must shape what Germany becomes next. Klaus sat in the chapel and understood what the pastor meant. He would go home carrying truth learned through 80 cents per day, and chocolate bars and iced tea. Truth about what real strength looked like, what real civilization achieved. Truth that Germany would need if it was to rebuild into something better than what it had been. The winter passed slowly. January 1945 brought news of Soviet advances in the east. February brought Allied advances in the west. March brought the crossing of the Rhine. April brought American and Soviet forces meeting in Germany's heart. And May brought surrender. Klaus heard the news on May 8, 1945. Germany had surrendered unconditionally. The Reich was finished. Hitler was dead. Suicide in a bunker. The coward's way out. Everything Klaus had fought for, everything he'd believed in, everything that had shaped his youth was gone. He sat on his bunk that evening and felt nothing. Not grief, not relief, just emptiness. 25 years old, his entire adult life spent serving a regime that had been evil from the start. And now it was over. The question was, what came next? Repatriation wouldn't come quickly. Germany was destroyed, occupied, divided into zones. There was no functioning government to receive returning prisoners. The Allies announced that POWs would be held until conditions stabilized enough for organized return. It might take months. It might take years. Klaus continued working. The school in Bryan was completed in June 1945, and he attended the dedication ceremony along with other prisoners who'd worked on it. Mrs. Henderson gave a speech thanking the construction crew, including the German POWs. She looked directly at Klaus and the others when she spoke. These men helped build a place where our children will learn and grow. Whatever else they may have done in the war, whatever they may have believed, they have contributed something good here. I hope they can take pride in that. Klaus couldn't answer. His throat was too tight. But he stood when the audience applauded, and he accepted that acknowledgement with a bow, and he felt something shift inside him. Pride in building rather than destroying. Satisfaction in creating rather than conquering. It was a small thing, a school in Texas, but it was real and good, and it would outlast the Reich by generations. Summer and autumn brought more waiting. New prisoners arrived, men who'd fought to the very end, who'd been captured in Germany itself. They brought stories of total destruction, cities reduced to rubble, populations starving. Infrastructure collapsed. Germany was a corpse, and the Allies were trying to figure out what to do with it. Klaus sent money home when he could, though he had no idea if it ever arrived. He worked, he studied English, he attended chapel services and listened to Pastor Gerhardt speak about forgiveness and rebuilding. He talked with Ernst and Otto and Friedrich about what they would do when they finally went home. All of them agreed, never again. Never again would they follow charismatic leaders making impossible promises. Never again would they accept easy answers to complex questions. Never again would they believe in superior races and inferior peoples. The lessons learned through 80 cents per day had been expensive in ways that had nothing to do with money. Winter 1945-46 brought the first organized repatriations. Prisoners began leaving Camp Hearn in groups, transported to ports, shipped across the Atlantic to a Germany none of them would recognize. Klaus's group was scheduled for January 1946. He spent his last weeks in Texas saying goodbye to places that had become strangely familiar: the cotton fields, the school in Bryan, the chapel where he'd found something like faith. Private Johnson, now Corporal Johnson, with the war over and demobilization slow, shook Klaus's hand the day before departure. "Hope you find your family well," Johnson said in English Klaus could now understand easily. "Hope Germany rebuilds into something good." "Thank you," Klaus replied. "Thank you for treating us well, for showing us truth." Johnson looked uncomfortable. "Just did my job. Geneva Convention and all that." "No, more than that. You treated us like humans, like people. Not like enemies or inferiors. That mattered." The Atlantic crossing in January 1946 was different from the crossing in 1943. The ship was crowded, conditions were basic, but Klaus was healthy, well-fed, carrying savings in American currency that might be useful in occupied Germany. Around him, other prisoners talked quietly about what they'd face at home: destroyed cities, lost family members, occupation by foreign powers, an uncertain future. The ship docked in Bremen in late January. Klaus stepped onto German soil for the first time in nearly 3 years and barely recognized his homeland. The port city was devastated, rubble everywhere, buildings collapsed, infrastructure destroyed. American and British occupation forces maintained order, but the population looked gaunt, desperate, traumatized. The journey to Stuttgart took 3 days on damaged rail lines. Klaus watched Germany pass by the train window and struggled to process what he saw. Cities reduced to ruins, bridges destroyed, factories smashed, refugees everywhere, displaced persons wandering roads with nowhere to go. This was what total war looked like when you lost. This was what the American propaganda newspapers had warned would happen. And it had. Stuttgart was worse than Klaus had imagined. His neighborhood was rubble. The apartment building where he'd grown up was a shell. Walls standing, but everything inside destroyed. He asked neighbors, those who remained, about his family. His father had died in a bombing raid in October 1944. His mother and sister had been evacuated to a village outside the city. Klaus found them there, in a small cottage they shared with another refugee family. His mother looked ancient, aged 20 years and 3. His sister Maria was 19 now, thin as a rail, her eyes haunted by whatever she'd experienced. They wept when they saw him, touching his face as if to verify he was real. "You look so healthy," his mother said wonderingly. "So strong. The Americans treated you well?" Klaus nodded, unable to speak. He looked healthy because he'd been imprisoned by an enemy that fed its prisoners better than Germany fed its soldiers. He was strong because he'd done farm labor in Texas instead of starving on the Eastern Front. He was alive because he'd been defeated. That evening, he gave them the money he'd saved, over $300 American, converted to occupation marks. It would help them buy food, find better housing eventually, survive until Germany began to rebuild. His mother took the money with trembling hands. "You earned this?" "The Americans paid us for work, 80 cents per day. I saved most of it." Maria stared at him. "They paid you." Klaus told them everything. About Camp Hearn, about the cotton fields and the canteen and the school construction, about Private Johnson and Mrs. Henderson and the farmer who'd shared coffee, about chocolate bars and Coca-Cola and wages earned through honest labor, about discovering that everything the propaganda had taught them was a lie. His mother listened in silence. When he finished, she said quietly, "Your father never believed the propaganda." "Not really. He said the Nazis would destroy Germany." He was right. Over the following months, Klaus helped his family rebuild what they could. He found work doing carpentry, skills learned in Texas put to use repairing damaged buildings in Stuttgart. The work was hard, resources were scarce, but Klaus knew how to frame a wall properly, how to ensure square corners, how to build things that would last. Murphy's lessons in Texas served him well in ruined Germany. He attended public meetings about Germany's future, listened to discussions about democracy and reconstruction, and learning from the past. Germany was being rebuilt, literally and figuratively, under Allied supervision. The occupation forces were strict, but not cruel. They provided food aid, medical supplies, resources for rebuilding. They were teaching Germans how to build a different kind of society. Klaus thought often about Camp Hearn, about the contrast between propaganda and reality, about how the enemy had treated him better than his own government had, about the lessons learned through 80 cents per day. Years passed. Germany rebuilt slowly. The Federal Republic emerged from occupation, democratic and peaceful, oriented toward the West. Klaus married in 1950, a Stuttgart girl named Anna, who'd lost her first fiancé at Stalingrad. They built a life together, modest but stable, based on honest work and simple pleasures. Klaus became a master carpenter, trained apprentices, built houses and schools and community centers in the new Germany. He never spoke publicly about his time in Texas. It wasn't that he was ashamed, just that the experience was too complex to explain easily. How do you tell people that imprisonment taught you the truth? That the enemy showed you what your own government had hidden? That 80 cents per day purchased your re-education? But in 1965, a historian researching German POW experiences in America contacted Klaus. The historian was writing a book about prisoner treatment, comparing American, British, and Soviet approaches. Would Klaus be willing to be interviewed? Klaus agreed. He sat in his Stuttgart living room, now 51 years old, and told his story to a young academic who took careful notes. He described the first day at Camp Hearn, the canteen coupons, the chocolate bar, the Coca-Cola, the accumulation of evidence that shattered propaganda, the psychological transformation from believer to witness. What was the most significant moment? The historian asked. The one that changed everything? Klaus thought about it. The chocolate, the school construction, Mrs. Henderson's speech, Private Johnson's basic decency. There were so many moments, each one a small revelation. The first day, he said finally. The 80 cents, the canteen coupons, because in that moment I understood that everything I'd been taught was a lie, not just about America, about everything, about superiority and destiny and who we were. Those 80 cents were worth more than any propaganda poster or speech or newsreel. They were truth in its simplest form. The historian nodded and made notes. Do you think other prisoners had similar experiences? All of us, every man in that camp, went through the same transformation. Some faster, some slower, some resisted longer, but the evidence was overwhelming. You can't maintain propaganda beliefs when reality contradicts them every single day. And you think that experience, learning these truths as prisoners, was important for post-war Germany? Klaus considered carefully. We came home carrying knowledge. We'd seen what a democratic society looked like, how it functioned, how it treated people. We'd seen abundance created through cooperation rather than conquest. We'd seen basic human decency between enemies. That knowledge helped shape what Germany became after the war. We built this democracy partly because we'd seen it work in America. The interview ended. The book was published in 1967. Klaus read his own words in print and felt strange, validated somehow. His experience had mattered. The lessons learned through 80 cents per day had contributed to building a better Germany. He lived until 1989, long enough to see the Berlin Wall fall, long enough to watch Germany reunify as a peaceful democracy. In his final years, when his grandchildren asked about the war, he told them about Texas, about cotton fields and canteen stores and chocolate bars, about how he'd learned the truth through small wages and unexpected kindness. I fought for evil, he would tell them. I believed lies. I participated in a system that caused tremendous suffering. But I also learned, eventually, what truth looked like. That learning came from the strangest place, from imprisonment by the enemy I'd been taught to hate. Those lessons shaped my life and, in some small way, shaped the Germany you live in now. His grandchildren would listen with wide eyes, trying to imagine their grandfather as a young soldier discovering America's abundance for the first time, trying to understand a world where chocolate bars and Coca-Cola were revelations, where 80 cents per day could purchase transformation. Klaus Bergmann died in January 1989, 11 months before the wall fell. His funeral was simple, attended by family and friends and former apprentices whose skills he taught. On his desk at home, his children found a small wooden box. Inside, a faded canteen coupon from Camp Hearn, Texas. 80 cents dated September 14, 1943. He'd kept it for 46 years. The 80 cents hadn't just purchased goods from a prison camp canteen. They'd purchased truth. They'd shown one young German soldier that his beliefs were lies, that the enemy was human, that strength came from productivity and decency rather than conquest and cruelty. They'd contributed to his transformation from a believer in Nazi ideology to a builder of democratic Germany. Decades later, when historians studied the surprisingly successful reintegration of German POWs into post-war society, they noted that men who'd been imprisoned in American camps showed more democratic attitudes and less lingering Nazi sympathy than those imprisoned elsewhere. The experience of American captivity had taught lessons that no propaganda could counter: fair treatment, material abundance, basic human dignity. These weren't abstract concepts. They were daily realities experienced through canteen stores and farm labor and school construction. The 80 cents Klaus Bergmann earned on September 14, 1943, for picking cotton in Texas fields had accomplished what weapons never could. They'd shown him the truth, and truth, once seen clearly, cannot be unseen.